Welcome. We're joined by Dr. Laurence Broers, a Chatham House Fellow and expert on the South Caucasus. Laurence, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me on the show.
So you have taken a great interest in frozen conflicts, and kudos in a way, because I believe there wasn't much attention drawn to many frozen conflicts, and what the 2020 Karabakh war has proven is that any frozen conflict can unfreeze. But how do you see the situation developing now? The Kremlin has stated that the conditions are there now to fully resolve the Karabakh issue. I'm curious what you think about this.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think, for many years there were quite a few of us who were saying that frozen conflict is absolutely not the right paradigm for understanding what was happening on the ground between Armenia and Azerbaijan. In my book, I wrote about this idea of enduring rivalry, a long-term militarized competition playing out at the level of two states, Armenia and Azerbaijan, and I think that was very much the dynamic that we saw, particularly since 2014. Now, we have this trilateral agreement between Russia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. I think it's important to underline that it's not a peace agreement. It's a sort of a tactical improvisation. It brings together the new facts on the ground created by this 6-week war, some old ideas that have been circulating in the peace process, such as a transit corridor across southern Armenia, and a strong dose of geopolitical interests. I think what's interesting about this agreement is that it really it truncates decisive outcomes. It acknowledges an Azerbaijani victory, but makes it incomplete. It sort of ratifies an Armenian defeat, but again, makes it incomplete, less than total. And so I think there's a sense of in which this agreement can give a feeling of unfinished business. The core issue that is contested by Armenians and Azerbaijanis, which is the status of Nagorno-Karabakh, is not mentioned in the agreement, and it's hard to see how we might see a normalization of relations between the two states without this issue in one way or another being resolved. So I think this agreement doesn't really lay the basis for a long-term normalization. It's much more about quite hard arrangements in the field of security and in transit. And you need a lot of soft infrastructure around that for it to be viable.
But do you think the issue of status will be resolved? Because the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, has said that negotiations will take place regarding status, but Baku has still taken the line that the status issue will not be in favor of the Armenians. What do you think about this?
Yes, I mean, President Putin has said this isn't the whole story, that there needs to be a negotiations process, that the Minsk group, the OSCE Minsk process will continue in some form and address the status issue amongst all the other issues that would be needed for a fuller normalization. President Ilham Aliyev has said that there will be no special status for Nagorno-Karabakh for as long as he is president. I think it's just too early to say how this dynamic might unfold. I think it raises interesting questions about, what might the reality be in Nagorno-Karabakh over the coming years. In a sense, what we could see, Nagorno-Karabakh beginning to look perhaps more like South Ossetia, a heavily militarized, quite Russified enclave that isn't part of Azerbaijan, but isn't really part of Armenia either. So I think it's a very ambiguous situation. We need to see, I think, first of all, the extent to which displaced Karabakh Armenians return to the territory and the extent to which it can be rebuilt and offer a kind of a normal life to the people who were living there before the conflict.
And with regards to the Armenian government, do you think that any mistakes were made that, if they weren't done, could have led to the aversion of the eventual capitulation?
Well, it's a very challenging question, I think. I think there are broader retrospective questions about compromising from a position of strength. I know there's a lot of discussion now in Armenia about the negotiating position of Vardan Petrosyan back in the late 1990s, and the alternative approach, which was championed by Robert Kocharyan, which was that we can survive the status quo, we can make the status quo work for us, and that held for a certain period. But obviously, that idea, that strategy collapsed in September of this year. So I think there are broader questions around your negotiating position, knowing when to compromise. And I think with specific regard to the conduct of the war, as I'm sure you're aware, President Putin has said that already some 20 days before the end of the conflict, he had persuaded Nikol Pashinyan, he had persuaded Ilham Aliyev, to halt hostilities, and Nikol Pashinyan held out. So I think that there are going to be very difficult questions to be considered around the conduct of the war and the strategic outlook of Armenia over the last 15 years. That deterrent structure essentially broke down in September, and so I think we will see, and we will continue to see, high-level resignations coming in Armenia in the aftermath of this conflict.
And as for Russia, do you think Russia now has secured its influence in the South Caucasus? Many in Armenia thought that a total Armenian military defeat would spell the end of Russian influence and the start of Turkish hegemony. How do you see Russia's position now in the South Caucasus?
Well, I think that's exactly the point. We haven't seen a complete Armenian military defeat. The Russian intervention actually fixed the conflict at a particular moment in time when there is still a residual Nagorno-Karabakh that is controlled and populated by Armenians that has not become part of Azerbaijan. So, in terms of Russia's position, the wider narrative is that this has been a spectacular geopolitical play, the achievement and securing of Russian interests over the long term, an act of a geopolitical hegemon reasserting itself in part of its periphery. I see things slightly differently. Essentially, my emphasis is on Russia's tactical flexibility. A real hegemon institutes kind of different ways of controlling and ordering the area under its influence. You set up regional security organizations that other states want to be members of. You provide trade and aid, economic regional organizations that your neighboring states want to be members of. And you have ordering effects. You set down values that other states want to follow. And I don't think that is what we see, in fact, in the former Soviet Union. We see different states pursuing, as far as they can, foreign policy autonomy from Russia. And so I think, to come in and insert a heavy peacekeeping mission into a conflict is actually, not the way that a hegemon would normally behave. It is more of a tactical improvisation in the face of a worse outcome, which was alluded to in your question, a complete Azerbaijani military victory sponsored by Turkey and really, solidifying Turkey's role as a security actor in the South Caucasus. What Russia has done is prevented that. So yes, it has secured Russian interests in the short term. But I think this issue of the renewal of the mandate of the peacekeeping mission is going to become a very contentious issue over time in Russia's relations with Azerbaijan. So I think over the medium to long term, this will become an increasingly contested and potentially festering issue in Russia's bilateral agenda with both states, with both Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Well, currently there's a political crisis in Armenia, and many are debating whether the Prime Minister should go or stay. But I'm curious what you think the situation is like in Azerbaijan. Many are saying now that President Ilham Aliyev is more popular than ever. I want to understand what you think is next for Azerbaijan.
Well, I think that's certainly true in the short term. I think President Ilham Aliyev has now unprecedented popularity. over the medium to long term, as I've already alluded to, I think the issue of the presence of a substantial Russian peacekeeping mission on Azerbaijani territory will become a more contentious issue. It may be that we see the emergence of veterans as a factor in Azerbaijani politics. Veterans played quite a negative role in Armenian politics after the first Karabakh War. It took some time for that to develop. So, we may see new dynamics proceeding from that angle. But I think overall, Azerbaijan now faces an absolutely enormous task of resettling and building viable communities in the deoccupied areas. And when we look at some of those regions, when you look at Kelbajar, for instance, it still will have Nagorno-Karabakh on one side, Armenia on the other, the mountain ranges to the north, Lachin similarly surrounded, Zangilan to the south, similarly with Armenia just next door. I think the challenge is going to be to create viable communities where people really want to live, rather than highly securitized frontier communities that are very dependent on the state. And for that to happen, these transit arrangements need to be embedded within a wider system of new interdependencies that also embed Armenian interests and create a stake for Armenians in those transit arrangements, for them to become really multipliers of trade, of commercial relations, and so on. So I think the challenge for Azerbaijan today is to be generous in victory, having lived through a quarter century of humiliation, rather than recommitting to the cycle of zero-sum relations in the aftermath of this war.
Well, just to expand a little bit more on that, I'm wondering what you think can be done in terms of reconciliation. Anti-Azerbaijani sentiment is at an all-time high in Armenia, but at the same time, Azerbaijan has allowed certain settlements to stay under Armenian control. What do you think can be done to reconcile the two sides? And do you think this is possible? Do you think this will happen?
Well, I think in the short term, it's very difficult to talk about that. The OSCE Minsk process, peace building in general, I think is at a low point in terms of how people in the region are looking on the prospects for peace building. At the same time, for all of these arrangements that are in the trilateral agreement to actually work and to be viable in the long term, you need a transformation in political relations. So, how do you generate real long-term security? It's not through having a large, well-armed peacekeeping contingent. It's through transforming political relations so that communities no longer see each other as a threat. How do you create new trade relations, transit corridors that actually work as multipliers of wealth and of well-being? You do that through normalizing relations so that rather than having safe passage through enemy territory, you have freedom of movement, free transit, total access across borders that become soft and symbolic. So in a sense, without a peace building reconciliation component, none of these arrangements are really going to be viable. They will not result in a wider transformation of the South Caucasus, as President Putin has been talking about. We're also going to see now communities living in quite close proximity to one another, who are saturated with the worst possible stereotypes about one another. And we've also seen just in the last week to 10 days how specific issues such as cultural heritage can really become very toxic and very divisive across the conflict divide. So I think there is de facto a very urgent need for work to support reconciliation, to support a transformation of relations, and that is the only way I think that we will see a wider transformation of the region, rather than a repeat of the last 25 years, where we saw, transport corridors working around conflict and simply embedding it for another generation to deal with.
Well, Laurence, thank you as always.
Thank you very much, Emilio.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.